Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a vlog-style wrap-up of the reading that I did in the first week of May, because a couple of the books that I read I had to take back to the library almost immediately, because one I was ending up with a fine on, and the other one I just realized that it was due back the night before it was due back, and thought, okay, we need to get through these quickly. And I thought I would try vlogging this stuff. But I'm terrible with vlogging, so it didn't quite work out. But let's talk about these books. So the book that I ended up with fines on was The Woo Woo, How I Survived Ice Hockey, Drug Raids, Demons, and My Crazy Chinese Family by Lindsay Wong, which was on the Canada Reads list this year. It is a memoir, and it was also Lindsay Wong's MFA project. She did her master's in creative nonfiction, and surprisingly to me, because I feel like most of the books you read, whether they're novels or memoirs or anything else, that are someone's MFA project, they tend to be incredibly polished, and you get the feeling over-edited because so many of their classmates and profs and whatnot went through it. And this one is almost the opposite, so I wonder how that process worked for this one, because there were a number of points where I thought, this would have been stronger if that was different. That wasn't what happened here. So it surprised me. It definitely threw my expectations when it comes to MFA project writing. This was actually an intriguing memoir because it is about a family that is very well off, that lives in a very wealthy suburb of Vancouver, but where there is so much mental illness in the family that their lifestyle is something that you would almost associate with poverty, but it's just that, as it says in the title, people are crazy. And I think there's a negativity attached with labeling behaviors that are caused by mental illness as crazy in a negative way. But the result of the untreated mental illness in this family does result in people being very seriously abused. Like, the author at one point is burned by her mother. Her mother, in turn, was left outside to die at one point as a child by her grandmother. And there is a lot of really horrific stuff like that. Now, because so many incidents of it are described, at a certain point it almost becomes blasé, which it shouldn't, because the things that are happening are just horrifying. And a lot of it you can see is things that are compounding. In the case of her grandmother, for example, her grandmother has schizophrenia, but also has PTSD because she lived through the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong and had a compulsive gambling husband. And at one point when her grandmother was young, her father and brothers all immigrated to Canada and they left her behind. And her family didn't decide to sponsor her until the 1970s. And so you think about her trauma and then how she passes that on to her children and then the children's children. And it's horrible. And this is not a book that was written after the author came to terms with any of that. The turning point that we get is that the author is diagnosed with a migraine disorder that causes her hallucinations, because she had been assuming that she was falling into mental illness the way her grandmother and her mother and her aunt. Her mother's sister is, if you remember, this was actually in the news and I remember hearing about this, that on Canada Day a woman tried to jump off this bridge in Vancouver, and which stopped the traffic and people were going to see fireworks, so it just became a news story. And that was her family that was happening with. It's very extreme stuff, and it's shocking to read, and it's eye-opening to read, because I think there's an idea that somebody who lives in this incredibly wealthy neighborhood with, and I mean her family, she talks about that she felt poor as a kid. The families in her neighborhood were ultra rich and her family was just upper middle class. But there just isn't a lot of resolution at the end, which is an issue I've had with a couple of other memoirs that I've read over the past year and a half, where the stories that are being shared are powerful and they're probably important to see shared, but as a piece of writing on its own, it felt like it was missing something to tie it together, or a longer period of reflection before writing it, maybe. It was definitely worth reading to hear the stories and to think about that kind of thing, but yeah, if you're looking for a piece of writing with more reflection to it, that's not really what this is, but it was still very compelling. I read it very quickly, and not just because there were fines amassing on it. So next up, I read what is kind of an old school middle grade young adult bridging type book called Rebound by Eric Walters. I'm going to insert some footage of the book here, and you'll see that one of the characters on the cover is in the most stereotypically institutional wheelchair. I'm kind of appalled by that. But based on the writing, he has a normal chair, so just you can ignore the cover. And it's basically about one boy who's trying to get himself out of the social trouble he'd gotten into the year before so he doesn't get suspended, and his friend who is kind of aggressive because he's recently become a paraplegic and is dealing with that. This was sort of recommended to me by a friend who's a school librarian because we were talking about basically sports writing for kids and specifically disability in sports writing for kids. Now, my friend liked this a lot more than I did, and she recommended it to me on the grounds that it dealt with wheelchair basketball, which it does not. That shows up 2 pages before the end, and it is mostly about the non-disabled kid getting on his basketball team. A lot of the plot points are very cliche, and I think that's fine. This writer has been writing books for this age group forever, and as storytelling goes, it's fine. As a sports story goes, it was okay. I felt like the disability elements were so stereotyped that I thought was kind of unfortunate. Because again, if this were not an issue book, if this were a book for adults, I'd just say, whatever, not for me. But because this is a book that is supposed to be teaching kids a lesson, I thought it was too bad that it had to go the direction that it went. But there we go. It's also a fast read, and it was also published in 2000, so I don't think it's particularly topical now. I was actually shocked that it was published in 2000 because it reads like something that would have been written in the late 80s, early 90s. I fully expected it to be pre-Harry Potter because I think that was sort of the turning point for when young adult fiction and middle grade fiction were separated out in a much stronger way, whereas there used to be this grouping that was basically for 11 to 15-year-olds, and this is definitely in that style. But yeah, that's back at the library now. Finally is a book that I'm going to take back to the library in about 15 minutes. That is Her Fugitive Heart by Tantimedh. This was just released, so I was hyped to be the first person to get this out of the library. This is the newest book in the Ravi PI series, which I wish had been out in March because I would have read it for March Mystery Madness. But the author is Thai from Singapore, and the character is an Indian-British guy, which means it does count for the Asian Readathon, so it still is readathon material. In any case, this is a series that I generally describe as fun trash. It's not particularly well done. A lot of it is characters telling each other about things that have happened, and not necessarily in descriptive ways. So there are a lot of fun stories, like, this character was planning a coup, here's how that went wrong. Or these characters accidentally murdered this person they were supposed to be looking for. But you don't actually get to see those things as scenes, you just hear about them as characters telling each other, which as a storytelling device isn't done particularly well, but all of the stories are so ridiculous that it's kind of entertaining anyway. This is also the series that I've been cynical about, because you can see there's a picture of an actor on the cover, because the first novel was optioned for a TV series, but they haven't actually made the TV series, so I think it's kind of silly that they get the actor cover, but whatever. It's reasonably entertaining, wackiness happens. You can't really talk about the plot in this series because each novel could almost be described as a series of stories. This could almost be 3 short stories and a novella, as opposed to a single novel, because there are separate pieces that they're working on, and it almost tricks you into thinking that they're linked together more, because as you get the cases where it's just, for example, this investigator's 2 co-workers, who are kind of the enforcers, talking about how they accidentally murdered someone, and you think, okay, that's going to lead into the later stories, but it doesn't. They are fairly independent of each other. I don't know, I feel like this one was the most that had the least storytelling and more, here's some big mad ideas, and the big mad ideas are a lot of fun. There just isn't a lot of storytelling to it, which is a bit weird in a book that's about 300 pages long. So, but still, it was fun. Again, it was something that's incredibly fast to read, so yeah, there we go. So those are the 3 books that I read this week that I won't be discussing in a separate video. I'm clearly going to have to work on properly vlogging if I want to do that in the future, but this was an attempt. So there we go. Anyway, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. If you've read anything similar, I'd love to hear about that as well. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.